Welcome to the YouTube channel of Veritas Forum Finland. Besides the normal debates and discussions at the university context, we time to time interview Christian scholars, at least when they're visiting Finland. And today we have Professor Oliver Crisp from the University of St. Andrews visiting Finland at the moment. Welcome to Finland.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good. You are the professor of Analytic Theology at the university.
That's true. I am, yes.
And you just said that it's the first of a kind. You are the first of a kind.
I suppose I am. The title and the chair, as they say in the UK, is the first chair in Analytic Theology that I'm aware of. So I think, yes, that's right. I'm the first. And I'm the first person to hold that chair. So yes, that's a first on two fronts.
Okay, and that's about the 5th or 6th month that you're holding it.
That's right. Yeah, we moved back to the United Kingdom from the United States in August of last year, so we've been there nearly 6 months.
Okay. Yeah, great to have you here.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a beautiful country. I've been really enjoying walking around Helsinki and getting a sense of things. It's amazing.
Yeah, good. Thanks. In this interview, we're going to mostly talk about analytic theology. But the very first question I would like to ask from you is about the relationship of theology to other fields of other disciplines. And you have been the editor, one of the editors of a book called Christianity and the Disciplines. And in that book, you try to ask the question whether Christian theology could have an influence to other fields. And my first question related to that would be that is the university or the Christian intellectual tradition somehow in some kind of special kind of need of this influence? And if it is it perhaps somehow urgent, this need?
Well, I think I think that project was largely about us trying to, the little group of us that got together, and we did two books, in fact. One was on philosophy and theology, and the other one was Christianity and the Disciplines, and they were supposed to be two parts of one whole. So one was trying to ascertain what's the relationship between philosophy and theology, and how do those two ways of thinking about some of these fundamental questions about the world and our place in it relate to one another. And then more broadly, in the Christian tradition, how does Christian theology relate to the kind of range of intellectual disciplines in the university? And you ask whether there's some special need for that. I think in some respects there is. I mean, I don't think that Christian theology necessarily has a kind of privileged position with respect to other disciplines in the university. But what I do think is that in those countries that have inherited this kind of tradition of Christian thought, there is, I think, a need to think about how it is that our religious tradition and the kind of intellectual questions that it raises relate to other sorts of areas in the university. Sometimes I think can be a concern that theology or religious studies can be hived off from many other aspects of university life and can form something like a kind of ghetto where you're just talking to one another. What we wanted to do was say, how does what we do as theologians relate to what the philosophers do, and how does it relate to what people are doing in the sciences, what people are doing in the social sciences, what people are doing in other humanities? Are there ways in which what we do in theology can inform and build bridges with these other disciplines? Are there ways in which we can have a useful dialogue and conversation that perhaps isn't always happening? And what might that look like? Now, of course, in some disciplines it's easier to imagine than in others. So to some extent it's easier to imagine in certain sorts of humanities subjects like philosophy or perhaps literature, medieval studies, these sorts of things where you can find those kinds of connections. History.
They have already history between theology and, for instance, philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. So those sorts of things it's easier to build bridges with. Slightly more of a bridge needs to be built to other maybe social sciences like psychology, let's say, or perhaps law. And maybe an even larger bridge needs to be built to other areas like mathematics or chemistry or engineering or something like that. So I think we were trying to start to build those bridges. I don't think the project was conceived of as the last word on the subject, but hopefully the first word, or at least a first word. I mean, there are other people doing these sorts of things. Hopefully a word that helps to foster that kind of conversation.
Okay. So in building that bridge, or starting to build that bridge, what would be the from the Christian perspective, what would be the theological basis for that?
I think the theological basis for that is something like this, that all truth is God's truth. If you're a person of faith, and particularly if you're a person of Christian faith, then I presume you have this notion that there's a God who's the creator of the heavens and the earth and all that is contained therein. And presumably then you think that if that's the case, that fundamental theological claim should permeate and inform every area, every aspect of your life. If you think that's right, then it's a short step from there to think that whatever it is that we're studying and doing in various intellectual disciplines ultimately ought to be done to the glory of God and ultimately ought to reflect the truth that we find in the one who's created the heavens and the earth. So if you're committed to that kind of vision of theology and the kind of Christian approach to life, what you end up with is a kind of Christian worldview. Yeah. And with a Christian worldview, you have to have something to say about all these different things. How does mathematics relate to the Christian worldview? How does physics? How does chemistry? How does law? How does psychology? How does history? And so it seems to me that someone who's serious about their theology and serious about their religious commitments would want naturally to ask the question, if all truth is God's truth, ultimately, even if we can't always get at the truth very easily, then how ought that to be played out in the different disciplines that we work in? Because of course we're not all doing theology, but it might well be that people who are historians or physicists or lawyers may have a Christian faith and want to know how it is that their religious commitments and the theological views that they hold relate to or inform or can dialogue with whatever it is that their home discipline is. And so that seems to me to be a natural way to think about these things from a Christian perspective.
Yeah. Would you say that there has been some time in history that this kind of approach would have been more prevalent?
I think so. I mean, my sense is that in the sort of in the medieval universities as they grew up, you had faculties of medicine and law and theology as the kind of higher faculties, the faculties of arts. And naturally at that point in time, one thought of theology as the queen of the sciences. Yeah. It was the kind of capstone of a person's education to be able to ultimately get to a point of studying matters divine, as it were. That's clearly no longer the case. And since medieval times and the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the modern era, we've gradually seen a kind of displacement of theology, certainly in the Western world anyway, a displacement of theology from the place as queen of the sciences to very much something subject to other sorts of disciplines that are seen to be much more important. So I think there was that time. Often in theology, you get people looking back with slightly misty eyes to this kind of golden age of what happened in the medieval universities.
And the good old times.
The good old days, exactly. I mean, and there is lots to celebrate from that period, but I certainly wouldn't want to be too misty-eyed. I think there's lots of good things that are happening in universities today, and there's lots of reasons why theologians and people of faith would want to engage in the kind of discussion that presses knowledge forward. What can we know about various disciplines in the university? How is it that theology can help inform the dialogue going forward as we try and press up against the kind of bounds of what we know and understand of the world around us and the world that God has placed us in?
Yeah, definitely so. So now moving on to a different subject. The reason I asked the first question was mainly because it really relates to Veritas Forum quite heavily, because Veritas, the motto of originally comes from Harvard, which motto was originally Veritas, Christo et Ecclesiae. So relating to the Christian heritage of Harvard, for instance. So that's something really at the core of the vision of Veritas Forum. But the Analytic Theology, you're in Helsinki now attending a workshop in Analytic Theology.
Yeah.
And that begins tonight, I guess.
That's right, absolutely.
And could you briefly explain to the viewers that what Analytic Theology is?
Yes.
I suppose many of us are not very familiar with it.
Yes.
So just a brief explanation.
Certainly, yeah. Analytic theology is relatively new. It's something that's been around since about 2009, so it's about 10 years old. I mean, there are ways in which it was happening beforehand, but it's been named analytic theology at least since about 2009. And analytic theology, as far as I understand it, is basically a kind of method or way of doing theology. A lot of traditional theology, when it's looking for philosophical ideas or philosophical interlocutors, tends to appeal to certain sorts of secular philosophers in order to furnish the theological arguments with concepts like substance, being, essence, those sorts of things. And in the 20th century, you have this kind of bifurcation into two sorts of broad streams of theology: continental so-called theology and continental philosophy, I should say, and analytic philosophy. A lot of 20th century theology has paid attention to the continental tradition of philosophy and used those resources, but much less so with respect to the analytic tradition until recently. And what analytic theology is largely about is the redirection of the theological gaze from the continental to the analytic tradition, and encouraging theologians to engage with the analytic tradition of philosophy and bring some of the resources that you find in analytic philosophy into theology, to use those perhaps alongside the continental tradition, or at least perhaps even as an alternative in some respects to the continental tradition, because the analytic theologian thinks there are important ways in which what's being done in analytic philosophy can help us think about certain sorts of theological topics in theology. So that's, I would say in a nutshell, analytic theology is about using the resources of analytic philosophy to do theology. Okay.
In light of the first question, would you find it accurate to describe analytic theology as a field where another intellectual tradition, in this case analytic philosophy, is somehow in a fruitful relationship with theology?
Yes, yeah. That's exactly what we're hoping for, a more fruitful relationship between analytic philosophy and theology. And I think there's very good signs that is the case. I think certainly in the last 10 years, a lot of good work has been done, and the message of analytic theology, as it were, is getting out there, and people are paying attention to it. Graduate students are wanting to work on it, those sorts of things. So it's very encouraging to see that happen.
Yeah, good, great. So maybe an example would be also further illuminate this subject. In one of your recent articles called The Meticulous Providence,
yeah,
and you take on the subject of divine providence.
Yes.
And some of the ways that it could be related to different accounts of the free will. And you claim that the doctrine of providence is roomy enough, your term, for accounts that are both determinist and libertarian in regarding the free will.
Yes.
So how can providence be viewed in such different terms?
Well, in that paper, I was particularly concerned with a version of the doctrine of providence called meticulous providence, and that's the doctrine according to which God ordains or oversees everything that happens in the world. So, of course, not everybody agrees with meticulous providence, but my thought was, if you start with that, how does that play out with respect to how we understand human freedom in light of God's overseeing of all things? I think most people, when they look at the doctrine of meticulous providence and hear that it means God ordains all that takes place, tend to think, oh, well, that means we don't have free will, or if we do have free will, it's some very thin account of free will. Mm-hmm. And certainly there are versions of the doctrine of meticulous providence that have that consequence, and part of the paper was to try and outline that sort of approach, what's often called a kind of theologically determinist way of thinking, which basically means that God determines what takes place in the world. But we have freedom provided that's consistent with God determining things. But my task was to show, or to attempt to show, that in addition to that sort of standard way of thinking about meticulous providence, there might be other resources that mean that there's a broader or more roomy way of thinking about this meticulous approach that gives you options. I'm all for kind of maximizing metaphysical options rather than reducing them and sort of saying, well, look, these are difficult topics. Maybe there's more than one potential answer that we can explore as we try and think about them. So one alternative that you can find in the Christian tradition, going back to people like Thomas Aquinas in the medieval period, is this idea that God is ultimately over all things and bringing about all that takes place, but that this is at some kind of different sort of level from what's happening with respect to creatures and doesn't interfere with creaturely freedom, so that you can have some kind of notion of a kind of richer or thicker account of human freedom, which is consistent with what philosophers call libertarianism. And libertarianism is roughly the idea that that my actions, my free actions, are not determined by God or anything else.
You have real options in it.
Right, and I'm the source of my action in some fundamental way. Yeah. So that was the task. Whether I convinced anyone, I'm not sure, but I do think there are people working on this now who've also taken up this task to try and show that you can have a kind of meticulous account of God's providence and oversight in the creation, and yet have a strong account of human freedom. So people like Matthews Grant or Hugh McCann and other people of that sort have been trying to pursue this line in recent times. But really, they're picking up an ancient tradition going back to the medievals, and particularly Thomas Aquinas. So it's a kind of Thomist way of thinking about providence, that God is in control of all things, but if he's operating on a different level from human beings, then perhaps we can describe God's action in such a way that he concurs with what happens, my creaturely action, but not in such a way that it determines how that turns out.
Okay. Would you describe that in this case you use analytic theology, as you said, to expand our metaphysical options within this boundary of this meticulous providence doctrine?
Yes, exactly. And that's really what I was trying to do. So it was more of a sort of attempt to encourage theologians, and particularly analytic theologians, to take another look at what we might think the options are with respect to meticulous providence, and consider that there may be different ways of approaching solving this particular problem, or at least addressing this particular problem. Yeah.
As analytic theology is something of a newcomer
yes.
to the university and even theology, it has some enthusiasts and some critics.
Yep.
And some of the critics are Christian thinkers.
Yep.
Who fear that analytic theology is or will become just yet another philosophy disguising as theology, where when it happens, then the fear is that theology will end up serving some ends that are foreign to its true nature. Mm-hmm. So how would you respond to these worries that theology will become something that is not dealing with the questions that should be dealing, which is the knowledge of God?
This is a common worry with respect to analytic theology, or at least I've heard it commonly said that this is a concern. I am not quite sure why. It's more of a concern for analytic theology than theology that looks to continental resources. I think the more fundamental worry is any approach to theology using whatever philosophy it is that is particularly appropriate or particularly trendy at that particular moment in time. And of course, Christians down through the ages have picked up all sorts of philosophies in order to do their theologizing. The question is whether in doing that, what we end up doing is enslaving our theology to philosophy. Now, you can do that whatever your approach to theology, right? I mean, you could be someone who thinks that theology should be enslaved to the thought of Heidegger or Kant or Descartes or Aristotle. So it is not necessarily, it seems to me, a problem that's peculiar to analytic theology. And I certainly don't think that analytic theology, as it's usually practiced, is an approach to theology which enslaves theology to philosophy. I think the vast majority of people I know doing analytic theology are people who think of the role of philosophy as a kind of handmaidenly role. In other words, as something ancillary, something that comes alongside in order to help us do our theologizing, rather than a kind of mistress that stands over theology and dictates the terms. So I think in principle it's possible, of course, to do analytic theology in a way that enslaves the theology to the philosophy, but that's true of any approach to theology. So I don't think that's a peculiar worry about analytic theology. And I think, in fact, when you look at the lie of the land and see what actual analytic theologians are doing and read what they're saying, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of them are actually involved in something like an Anselmian project. The great doctor of the church, of the medieval church and Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, had this idea that theology should be faith-seeking understanding. We start standing within the Christian tradition as people of faith, and we seek to work out from there what we can of the faith that we have had passed on to us. So it's a faith that's seeking to understand better the deposit of faith that we're given and the theological ideas that arise out of that. And I think that analytic theology is really all about a kind of faith-seeking understanding approach to doing theology, and that's anything but enslaving theology to philosophy.
So it sounds like a very traditional way of conceiving the relationship of philosophy and theology.
I think in many ways it is. It is very much echoing the kind of great thinkers of the past in the Christian tradition who sought to use philosophical ideas to prosecute their theology, but not to enslave their theology to the philosophy.
Yeah. So what about then those critics who would rather see God questions kind of disappear from the secular university? I mean, there are many people, of course, who are quite content with theology, studying religion only as a social phenomenon or maybe as a history of thought of various religions, or Christianity or Islam, for instance. Would you say that there is something in analytic theology that also these people could value, that see that the theology as speaking questions about God, whether the claims are true or not, are not the business of secular university? Would you say that even those people could see something good in analytic theology?
I hope so, and I think that there is some promise in analytic theology as a dialogue partner for a number of different sorts of disciplines. So, for example, there's a number of different research grants going on in various parts of the world at the moment that is seeking to do what's sometimes called a science-engaged theology. So doing theology, but in serious engagement with the sciences, particularly the natural sciences and sciences, the human sciences like psychology and so on. And I think that analytic theology can, in some respects, be a kind of lingua franca in those kinds of contexts, because the way that analytic theologians approach theological topics, trying to break complex issues down to simpler parts, trying to uncover the logical form of arguments, trying to make super clear what their assumptions are right at the beginnings. You declare what your assumptions are, you make your argument, you then try and deal with objections as clearly as you can, look at the hardest objections and look at the hardest kind of counter arguments to the views that you hold, and then you try to rebut those counter arguments. So that sort of approach to theology that you find in the analytic theological community is, I think, a way of approaching theology that is conducive to the sorts of engagements with particularly the sciences that mean that a kind of science-engaged theology is something that analytic theology is particularly well suited to do. Will that convince the naysayers in the universities, the kind of cultured despisers of religion? I'm not sure whether it will convince them, but hopefully it will give them reason to pause and think, oh, well, maybe there's a reason for thinking that this approach to theology might be useful in prosecuting certain sorts of intellectual tasks that involve us seriously engaging with one another across disciplinary boundaries. So I think it might have that particular role.
So you sound at least a bit hopeful that it would.
I'm a kind of hopeful person. I like to build bridges rather than burn them, and I like to try to hold out a hand of dialogue to those with whom I disagree, in the hope that we can sit down and talk rather than close the door in people's faces. That's in general, I hope, been my approach to a lot of these sorts of questions, and has characterized a lot of the work that I've tried to do, both within theology and looking outside of theology to some of these other sorts of dialogues that we've been talking about this morning.
That all sounds very good. Thank you for being our visitor here in Veritas Forum Finland.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
It's been. Yeah.